trifecta here. We have three speakers, Julie McDonald, Corbin Gossett, and Mac Moore. Julie's going to start and she'll introduce the other speakers. You can put up her slide. Moving to the cloud, and Julie's Director of Business Development for Nimble Collective, and they're headquartered near Silicon Valley. Julie, take it away.
Great. So, hi everybody. I really appreciated the last presentation because it sets a great groundwork and background for our presentation, which is really a use case. So I also want to kind of go back to Al's original slide when he had the Apple and Newton and the gravity. So our talk is going to represent the demand side. So what are the forces, what are the market forces, what are the media and creative forces that are pulling your organizations into the cloud? So that's going to kind of form the context of what we're talking about. Excuse me. So my name is Julie McDonald. I'm Director of Business Development at Nimble Collective. I have to remember to breathe. It's hot up here. So Nimble is a platform as a service provider. We provide streaming tools to end users via a web browser. We're focused on serving all aspects of the production pipeline, from pre-pro through final rendering and output. My personal background is I started the editorial department and camera departments at Pixar Animation Studios over 20 years ago. I was hired by Steve to build out those pipelines. My colleagues today are Corbin Gossett, he's our Senior Product Manager at Nimble, and Mac Moore, who's Vice President Sales and Marketing at Conductor Tech. Corbin has over 25 years experience integrating animation pipelines for some of the world's largest films, and Mac spent many years at Autodesk and currently runs sales and marketing for Conductor. So let's just talk a little bit about why we are moving where we're moving. So as a producer, I'm going to represent to you what are the things that I'm concerned with. I want access to the global labor market. I want access to that market because I might have incentives coming from governments that are helping me reduce my overall labor costs. I want to have access to talent that is going to allow me to move my story forward. So again, just remembering that I'm presenting the business use case. I'm the pull. I'm on the demand side. So as a producer, there's three big parts of my budget that I'm concerned about. Carrying costs that are infrastructure related, connected to the tin that's back home, and my labor costs. So as I move towards commoditization of production tools, I'm motivated to drive costs down. So we talk about moving to the cloud as being a big benefit, and so our paper really discusses whether or not those benefits are myth or reality. So sticking with labor for the moment, as a producer or a studio owner, I'm concerned with human capital management. I have a couple of things that I know that are true about human capital management. Number one is that most of the globe works in the services sector. That's been true for the last 15 years and is unlikely to change. And 80% of my production budget is typically labor. So I'm going to want to keep my labor costs down, and I'm going to want to drive them down further. Companies have a choice whether or not to access labor by setting up a footprint and a technology footprint on a foreign shore, or bringing the technology to if I have a character designer who's the best in the business and I want a big ROI on a global blockbuster film, I am not going to necessarily want to take that character designer and move them and their family around the globe 4 or 5 times over 5 years. It's going to be better for me in the long run and better for my film if I can bring my infrastructure and my technology to that individual. There are several areas of risk that I have to deal with as a studio owner. Security is one. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I want to make sure that I get over to Corbin and Mac. This is a deep area, and our paper was, I think it started out at 40 pages, and then we had to cut it down to 20. So currently, we've got security, licensing. There's a market pressure to adopt with unproven benefits. Latency is a huge issue. I loved the slide with all those access points all over the world. I wish they were all really fast. They're not all really fast, so make them fast. And predictability. So when we get into the cloud, there's a lot of hoo-ha about it. It's, move to the cloud, move to the cloud. Well, as a person who brought, analog to digital, but way back in the day before Toy Story, I understand the difference between what we think is going to happen and how long it takes to get there. But I can definitely say that as a studio owner and as a producer, the driving forces are reduced infrastructure cost, reduced capital investment so that I, as a producer, can move my resources and put it towards talent and what's on the screen. That's what's going to give me the biggest ROI on my film or on my media. It's going to be the story, the beautiful story, and the quality of the images. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corbin. And Corbin's going to take us through our boots on the ground experience of cloud-based production pipelines.
Good morning. My name's Corbin, and we've noticed some changes. And so let's talk about some of those trends and stuff that we're seeing, or at least on our side. And this year, not just here at SMPTE conference, but all over, we've been, there's been a lot of discussion, there's been papers, there's been panels, and there's a lot of things on like global visual effects pipelines, cloud-based technologies, including storage and rendering, new production and pipeline methodologies that take globalization into account. And there's also lots of conversation on collaboration and filmmaking, and how do we do that and take advantage of the cloud. As Julie was mentioning, both artistic and technical talent are now more global than ever. Distribution, production is the norm, more so for a lot of companies, including a lot of the smaller collaborative filmmakers. Just look at California, Vancouver, Montreal, London. All these cities have multiple studios with the same name. And with that comes new opportunities. With all these changes, the global community is growing. You have games and films are still very big. You have online content creation, which is growing. And now we have VR and AR that are pushing the technologies with new ways of working and new ways of viewing content. And of course, with that, distribution changes are happening all the time. Netflix, Vimeo, Amazon, Hulu. Online has taken away more screen time from the traditional distribution methods. Cord cutting and subscription models are becoming more and more popular, and more the norm, actually. And if you look at kids today, not only do they have greater access to the tools and the education that actually I wish I had as a younger version of myself, but their content consumption habits are vastly different than our generation. And a key point here is that their willingness to work and collaborate remotely is much greater than it has in the past generations. And what's happening is technology is motivating a lot of these changes. And people are actually looking to the cloud, just like on the presentation we had before. Cloud computing is becoming ubiquitous. Studios are offsetting the cost by relying on the scalability of cloud computing. And the increase in the number of cloud providers and platform providers, including rendering services, are going up quite a bit. Workforces are relying more and more on cloud services in their daily workflow. If you just look at Google Cloud and Microsoft 365, it only makes sense that the production workflows will follow into the cloud. Now, there's multiple pathways to the clouds, and when you're looking at cloud-based production, there are multiple ways to take advantage of that. You can work locally and use the cloud for computing rendering, and this allows you to work on local computers with local storage, and then rely on things like rendering, where you offline and take advantage of off-site aggregated rendering infrastructures and service bureaus such as like Conductor or Zinc, or even proprietary rendering solutions. You can also work locally and use the cloud for burst computing. Burst computing is really an effective way to try out the cloud. It allows you to kind of harness the computing services, service bureaus, without actually jumping into the cloud. And then there's work locally and use the cloud to extend production capability, and this is what we call workforce scaling. The idea here is that studios with already existing pipelines and already existing infrastructures really hit a ceiling in the production capacity, and they want to extend that, and so they do that by outsourcing productions. So modeling, surfacing, lighting, things that are typically in a pipeline can all be done remotely using available streaming tools and or data syncing tools. And of course, the last one is the all-in approach. This is where some studios are looking at technology infrastructures for the whole end-to-end platform, or PaaS, allowing on-demand access to streaming tools, and more importantly, and key here, is the greater access to a more global labor market. Now, there's obviously the cloud providers that are typical. There's Amazon AWS. They just bought ThinkBox this year, which was a Deadline, and that's an application that provides on-demand licensing model. You have Google Cloud and their ability to scale with their compute services. They also bought Zinc Render, which is an online rendering service. You have Microsoft Azure that talked earlier. And then you have Conductor technology that is a secure cloud-based platform that allows people that are doing visual effects, VR and AR, and local animation pipelines to enable those studios to grow and offload rendering workflows in the cloud. And of course, with that, there's current, it's not just the cloud providers, but there's actually studios that are doing that today. You have a list of production companies such as Atomic Fiction. You've got past companies that I'll get into a little bit. Theory Studios and Long Winter Studios are two studios that actually have full remote pipelines. They don't have on-prem facilities. They work at home. They sync their stuff via Google Cloud or AWS. And then you have Artella, which is actually a full-based platform that allows you to collaborate together with your own virtual studio, including storage and rendering. There's MetaPipe, which is another new startup that's doing a lot of the same kind of things, where it's providing virtualized production pipeline. There's where Julie and I work, which is Nimble Creative, where basically we include everything from a studio level pipeline. We have rendering and storage and collaboration all from within a browser. So we're not actually using software. We can use a Chromebook and you just log in at Starbucks and start animating. And what's interesting is Alara, which is owned by the Foundry, is another one that's jumping into this space. And what was interesting is 2 years ago at SIGGRAPH, for example, there was 2 of us that really kind of started down this path. This year there were 6 or 7 more. So it's growing. And Zerply, which is interesting about Zerply, is they're this marketplace now for the creative talent. They're like the LinkedIn for animators and modelers and surfacers. But it's now become a very global market, so it's really interesting. Now with cloud production and new paradigms, with many new approaches and new tools, new workflows need to come up with, or need to be created, and new pipelines to create this content. And of course, there's barriers that still exist. Studios, they already have investment on on-prem hardware. Making the switch can be kind of nerve-wracking. Pipelines are hard to change, and even software licensing is not something that's been figured out yet. And then, of course, even with all the ways of communicating remotely, collaboration is still hard, and now you add multi-continent production into that. So typically, my background is from a technical director on feature films, especially there at DreamWorks. And most pipeline development is actually very organic. It's based on the needs of the studio, the production, the workflows, and the tools, and it's always evolving. Every show it changes and it continuously to push forward. So most people wish pipelines really look like this, and in reality, they look like this. It's because cloud pipelines, it's because the reality is that schedules get included into this process, redos, complexity, artistic leadership that want to just make the perfect pixel in an image, and it makes your pipeline you have to go back and redo and redo and redo. So the workflows and pipelines have yet to adapt to this new technique, and so that's part of the process that we're experimenting with, is how to make that possible. A good example is most content creation applications still rely on POSIX file systems. And so when you start getting into object stores on cloud-based services, not all data models that you create in production where you've got terabyte files, you've got hundreds of terabytes of just particle data or cache data for a big explosion and a big fight scene. All of that may not always work in an object store, but you want to keep and version those in an object store. So it's how do we learn how to adopt to these new technologies? And a lot of times compromises and changes have to happen. And as studios start to begin to build the ladder to the cloud, it's important to realize that it can be scary and it's not always perfect. And so one of the things that a lot of companies are starting to do is what we call becoming cloud native. And as they make the transition to the cloud, it's not just the technology issues, it's also social changes in the way artists work or the way that they're used to solving problems. You have artists that are always like, I need my shell, I need VI, I need to be able to hand edit that file. And that's not always the case, because you ask the question, when was the last time you hand edited a file? Well, it's about a year ago, but they're used to that. That's a security blanket. So part of it is the social change, it's not just the technology. And so what some studios are doing are becoming what we're calling cloud native. This approach allows the adoption of the cloud architecture, things like microservices and stuff, but they're doing that locally and on-prem. And it basically allows you to go without the commitment of being in a public cloud. Very similar to what the guys from Microsoft were talking about earlier. They're still on-premise, but they're using a local cloud, and it allows them to make that kind of first step in that transition to using the technologies and the new methodologies that cloud bring. So being cloud native is a way for the studios to really adopt cloud technologies, but without actually adopting working in the cloud. And cloud adoption can be really great. And what's interesting is that sometimes it's not always prevalent. And so what Mac's going to do is he's going to walk down some of the costs that they've noticed, and it's really actually really interesting. So Mac?
Thank you. So yeah, like Corbin said, I work for Conductor Technologies. I just came over earlier in the year from Autodesk, and what pulled me over here was this inflection point that I was seeing in the industry at Autodesk when we were moving from a shrink-wrap software company to a subscription-based company to a my workflow looks like this. Why the hell are you asking me to pay for all this money now when I'm not quite sure my forecast is accurate 3 years out or 4 years out or even 1 year out? And so the reason you saw early adoption with cloud in the rendering space is because we had this hair on fire event with rendering. We had these late cycles when Corbin's talking about that last perfect pixel. You want to defer and delay that final render as long as possible so that you have the artistic freedom to kind of work through the space. And when you're working through on-prem limitations with respect to render capacity, you kind of hamstring that artistic freedom a bit. So people immediately went years ago to this element of I'm going to jump that innovation chasm and I'm going to go into early majority. So I feel at Conductor that cloud for rendering is really in that immersive early majority phase where we're really not quite figuring out whether or not we want to jump, but how we want to jump. So that's what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. So the dilemma here is how do I cram all of this work into that little on-prem environment? And how do I decide or forecast what that on-prem environment should look like? Should it be 2,000 cores? Should it be 4,000 cores? So these are the conversations I'm having all the time, and those conversations aren't about what my feature functionality is of our service. It's about where that cost-benefit analysis sits for the ideal state of each individual studio as they go through work. How much on-prem demand am I going to have? How much capacity do I need? And do I set up my hybrid workflow such that I can then burst beyond the X number of cores? So it really gets into this value estimation. And this is where I think I've had a number of conversations since I came on board with a number of studios, and it has to do with the general impression of the cost valuation of cloud versus on-prem. How much does on-prem cost? So up until very recently, and we're trying to change this, it feels almost like my day job these days to kind of have these equation-based conversations on cost of on-prem versus cost of cloud. But up until recently, this is how people calculate things. How much does it cost? How long is it going to take me to depreciate that asset? And how much time am I getting on the render farm? So as long as I jam as much as possible into that piece, my render cost per machine hour is going to be pretty spot on and pretty valuable compared to the premium, let's call it, of going to the cloud. Well, I'm an engineer by background. I actually worked in the EE field for many years before I went to Autodesk. So I immediately went into, okay, well, we're going to solve this and we're going to figure out all the 1,000 inflection points that make up the actual cost. And so that came to a bit of a more complicated scenario where we start looking at the actuals associated with driving on-prem resources versus driving cloud resources. Right now, cloud is looked at as this premium, I gotta have it tomorrow, I need to dive in and pay the piper, so to speak, to get my frames out in my time frame, whether that's public cloud like Gerald was talking about, or whether that's a colo. All these things are taken into effect and everything gets thrown out the window budgetarily at the end of a cycle if you're about to miss a deadline, right? So we want to kind of calculate these things. So I kind of sat down the first 2 months on the job and started looking at, well, what does it mean to assess the value or the cost of your on-prem environment? And so, the first couple things that popped up are, well, not only is it compute and depreciation like we showed in the equation before, but it's powering, it's cooling the powering, right? And that is not inconsequential. And power in Soho and London is quite a different experience than power that is subsidized in Montreal, for instance. So those are different inflection points, and so it gets very specific very quickly. So I look at these two pieces. I look at facility or colo space, whether it's a local off-prem colo environment that I'm constantly using, that I have dedicated use pointing to that service. Maybe that's where I go when I need that last-minute burst, and I pay a premium for that 1-month rental or that 3-month rental. I look at storage. I look at networking. I look at networking support, uninterruptible power supply. And then, as I think Gerald as well as Corbin alluded to, there is a licensing impact. Am I going to break a EULA by bursting to the cloud, and what are my rights associated with that license stack? So what's my software cost going to be? Do I need to go buy perpetual licenses for that vendor versus this other vendor? Can I buy them a 1-month rental? What are my support personnel? I mean, that's always a touchy subject, right? Support personnel, it costs money to have support personnel run your local on-prem, and how many of those people do you have? You also have support personnel from an artistic standpoint. When you sit around waiting for renders, we had a studio that we were talking to a few months back. They had a local on-prem environment that was at max capacity, and that max capacity led to artists staying over for a weekend waiting for rendered frames to come back so they could run them back to the production supervisor. That equated to about $15,000 in overhead for that overtime. So that is not inconsequential amounts of money when you're trying to stay under budget. Okay? Now, this last bit also assumes that I can effectively take all this cost and run it back into that equation, albeit maybe some more variables. Well, in actuality, that's not the case, because there is cyclicality associated with how that process works. So what I've done is essentially taken real-world usage out of our data in our systems to then run what cyclicality would look like if someone had 1 project or 2 projects, how long those projects last in terms of duration. So now not only do I have cyclicality associated with the demand on the render, I also have overlay of that demand as the amount of projects increases over time. So then you get this really interesting pattern of, well, I can't necessarily just peanut butter everything into my gray on-prem. And do I get more on-prem? Do I get less? When do I burst? So these are the conversations we're having. But I think people are starting to recognize that all up, all in, there is significant value and cost savings associated with going to the cloud versus what I'm doing on-prem if balanced correctly. Okay? So the other assumption that I want to kind of throw some data around is this aspect of, well, when I'm making that decision of on-prem versus cloud, I just run the lowest or the highest amount that I'm going to be fully utilized on-prem, 100% utilized or very close to it. I'm going to be the most effective with on-prem, and then I'm going to burst to the cloud. Well, that's not actually the case. And what we found is there's this interesting inflection point, and this inflection point changes studio to studio. Sometimes it's as little as 70%. Sometimes it's as much as what I have here in the paper at 92 to 97. But as you start loading up, so you have project load left to right. So very shallow usage on the left, all the way up to almost 100% or right at 100% utilization on the right. And you see this cost value inflection point at a certain point where typically you think this is a linear line going from very cost effective from cloud versus on-prem when you're not doing much and you're just bursting one job to I have lots of project data that I need to move. And the reason this is happening is because there's a lot of ancillary behavior going on as you overload your on-prem system. And it has to do with artistic productivity, it has to do with support burdens, it has to do with software, colos. There's a lot of chaos that's ensued as you get close to this inflection point. But what we're finding is there is a tremendous value for cloud, and we're having these conversations with all of our studios at the moment with respect to where this inflection point is with their specific work environment. Okay? And so then I think this is where that ideal state of cloud and cloud usage for rendering comes into play, is now if we've essentially, based on the previous slide, taken cost out of the equation at some point of inflection of on-prem versus cloud, now we make a decision of, well, how parallelized can we get and how much time can we save? So here I have a 1,000 frame render and some data points associated with that 1,000 frame render on a 50 instance on-prem environment versus running every frame in parallel on an individual virtual machine in the cloud. And you can see, obviously, I pay a little penalty for ramp-up time. I got to get that stuff up into the cloud, whether it's a cache-based environment or I pull it up dynamically. Once I take that hit, though, you see I have almost a 16x turnaround time for no additional cost. And that's really what people are seeing. They're really seeing we can enable more of that artistic freedom that we were not allowed to do or not able to do with our previous on-prem renders before. And so now we're having these conversations in the 2017 and certainly more so walking into 2018 on where that hybrid inflection point is between on-prem and cloud. Thank you.
Thanks, Corbin and Mac. So just to summarize again, stepping back, thinking about the studio owner, the CEO, the producer, the folks, the CFO, having to make some of these decisions and take a look at all of these inputs, we can articulate what are the tangible rewards available today. Well, obviously, centralized data storage, from the point of view of production pipelines, versionable, always available assets, instantaneous onboarding. Certainly when you have the cloud and you have a platform that's pulling together streaming tools, you can instantaneously onboard talent, batch and burst rendering, as Mac articulated, which can be complicated and it takes some time to dig down into those numbers. Deep collaboration and access to a location-free labor market. This is going to be even more important in the future. Open source tools. So that speaks to the licensing piece. New models for licensing revenue will have to emerge, and we've already seen it now. Nimble's just done a recent deal with Pixar Animation Studios for metered rendering. Mac from Conductor also has solutions with regard to paying for rendering easily and quickly. So as we get into the EULAs and some of the binding EULAs, those things are probably going to need to open up and get a little more flexible. And as a group, as engineers and business owners and studios, the ability to influence the market makers through adoption and success. So right now we're seeing a fairly small number of studios working in the public cloud space. But cloud native and private cloud are obviously becoming more of a current norm. The public cloud requires security, low latency, incredibly fast data transfer. We're super excited about where the industry's going. We're going to continue to pull hard on your intelligence and your problem-solving capacities because we have a really hungry global market for media. And it wants to collaborate. Artists want to talk to each other around the world, so the demand side of this is going to just get bigger in our view. And we've been really happy to be here. Thanks for letting us talk to you guys today. That's our talk.
If you have any questions, you can line up. I have a question for Mac. Now, you had like a 50-field ROI spreadsheet there, and I appreciate that. I really do. But what I want to walk away with from here is a rule of thumb for what that spreadsheet represents. Do you have any rules of thumb? Say, if this and this, then that. I'm in the cloud or I'm going to be local. There must be some rules of thumb.
Yeah, I think probably the rule of thumb is, if you're running a render farm and you can pull utilization and you're below 70% utilized on that render farm, you are wasting money on-prem when you can burst to the cloud.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, absolutely, because those idle render nodes are essentially,
Wasting money?
they're ticking the meter. Even if they're sitting on site, you have support resources, you have depreciated assets. Those assets aren't getting updated, right? So Azure's doing a good job of updating those dynamically, and you're always getting the latest and greatest hardware. There are lots of key points, but yeah, 70%.
One more question. Do you have a dashboard that I can log on to and put in my numbers and say it makes sense to me to go with the cloud or to stay locally?
So I have plans of putting that on the website. I do not have that on the website. If you want to reach out to me, I think everyone has my contact info from this or can get it. I can certainly send you that spreadsheet. It's real. It's not JPEGs. It's so you can go in there, and I've tried to pull all the variables out so that if you have a specific cost point, many studios say, hey, I paid this for 2,000 nodes last year. I'm going to depreciate it over 5 years versus 1 year or 3 years. You can plug those in. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.